Apollo 13, the crisis that became NASA's finest hour. Welcome back to 15 Minutes of Curiosity, where we explore the stories that captivate the mind and stir the soul. Today, we're diving into one of NASA's most dramatic moments, Apollo 13, the mission that went from a planned moon landing to a tense fight for survival, and finally, to a historic rescue that remains one of the greatest examples of human problem-solving. This is not just a story about space. It's a story about resilience, teamwork, and ingenuity under unimaginable pressure. The context of the Apollo program. To understand Apollo 13, let's go back a bit. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy set an ambitious goal to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade ended. The Apollo program was born from this challenge, representing one of the most ambitious technological efforts in human history. By 1969, Apollo 11 had successfully landed Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon. Apollo 12 also succeeded later that year. With Apollo 13, NASA aimed to continue exploring new lunar sites and further develop operational experience. The crew. Apollo 13's crew included James A. Lovell Jr., mission commander, a veteran astronaut who had already flown on Gemini 7, Gemini 12, and Apollo 8, the first crewed spacecraft to orbit the moon. John L. Ajak. Swigert Jr., command module pilot. Swigert was assigned to the mission just days before launch, after the original CMP, Ken Mattingly, was grounded due to possible exposure to German measles. Fred W. Haise Jr., lunar module pilot, who was on his first spaceflight. Swigert's late addition was purely precautionary. Mattingly never developed measles. Launch, April 11, 1970. Apollo 13 lifted off on April 11, 1970, at 2:13 p.m. Eastern Time from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The Saturn V rocket performed normally, and soon the crew was on course for the moon. The spacecraft consisted of Odyssey, the command module, where the astronauts would live during most of the mission. Aquarius, the lunar module intended to land on the moon. The service module, containing oxygen tanks, fuel cells, and propulsion systems. For nearly 2 days, everything went according to plan. The explosion. At approximately 55 hours and 54 minutes into the mission, while the crew was around 320,000 kilometers, 200,000 miles from Earth, ground control requested a routine stirring of the oxygen tanks to prevent the liquid oxygen from stratifying. At 9:07 p.m. on April 13th, Jack Swigert flipped the switch. Moments later, a loud bang reverberated through the spacecraft. Warning lights flashed. Communications with Houston briefly crackled. "Houston, we've had a problem here." Swigert said it first. Then Lovell repeated the message. An explosion in oxygen tank number 2 inside the service module had severely damaged the spacecraft. The cause was later traced to damaged wiring inside the tank, originating from a ground test incident and a design flaw related to voltage incompatibilities that had gone undetected. The blast blew out part of the service module's exterior, vented much of the oxygen supply, and disabled 2 of the 3 fuel cells that provided electricity, water, and cabin heat. The immediate crisis. With the oxygen supply failing, the fuel cells shut down, cutting off power. The command module could no longer sustain life for the crew. The crew was forced to shut down Odyssey almost completely to preserve its batteries for re-entry. This meant transferring to the lunar module Aquarius, which had its own batteries and oxygen. Aquarius was designed to support 2 men for about 2 days. Now it would need to keep 3 men alive for nearly 4 days. The return strategy. NASA had to decide quickly how to bring the astronauts home. The safest course was to use the moon's gravity to slingshot the spacecraft back toward Earth. The free return trajectory. Aquarius's descent engine was fired to adjust their course, using procedures that engineers and astronauts on the ground hurriedly recalculated in real time. These improvised engine burns, performed with almost no onboard navigation computer and guided manually by referencing the Earth's position through the spacecraft windows, were executed perfectly by the crew. Resource management and engineering ingenuity. Survival now depended on stretching every resource. Power. The lunar module's electrical systems were minimized. Lights were turned off. Only critical systems remained on. Water. Rations were reduced to about 6 ounces, 170 milliliters of water per person per day, primarily to avoid dehydration. Temperature. With power down, cabin temperatures dropped to around 3 degrees, 38 degrees Celsius. The crew wore multiple layers to stay warm. Carbon dioxide. The lunar module's CO2 scrubbers were designed for 2 men, not 3, and CO2 levels started rising dangerously. The CO2 problem led to one of the most famous improvisations of the mission. The round lithium hydroxide canisters in Aquarius could not accept the square canisters from Odyssey. NASA engineers on the ground devised a way to adapt them using only items on board: plastic bags, cardboard, duct tape, and spacesuit hoses. The crew successfully assembled the device, sometimes called the mailbox, which effectively reduced CO2 to safe levels. Constant challenges. Throughout the crisis, the astronauts remained calm and professional, relying on years of rigorous training. The flight controllers and engineers at Mission Control, especially Under Flight Director Gene Kranz, worked around the clock. Kranz later famously stated, "Failure is not an option." However, this phrase wasn't spoken during the actual mission. It comes from the later 1995 film, Apollo 13. Nonetheless, it accurately reflects the mindset in Mission Control during those tense days. The final danger, re-entry. One of the greatest uncertainties was whether Odyssey would function after being powered down for so long. It was successfully brought back online in the hours leading up to re-entry. Another unknown was the condition of the heat shield, which could not be inspected. The astronauts had seen from Aquarius that one entire panel of the service module had been blown off, but the heat shield seemed intact. On April 17, 1970, after jettisoning the damaged service module and the lunar module, Odyssey re-entered Earth's atmosphere. As usual, radio blackout occurred due to ionized plasma during re-entry, lasting around 4 minutes. For Apollo 13, this blackout period felt agonizingly long to those on the ground, though it was within expected parameters. Finally, Odyssey's parachutes deployed, and the spacecraft splashed down safely in the South Pacific Ocean. The aftermath. The crew was recovered by the USS Iwo Jima. All 3 men were physically safe, though they had lost significant weight and endured extreme stress. NASA conducted a full investigation, confirming that the accident resulted from faulty wiring damage during manufacturing and ground tests, inadequate testing procedures that failed to reveal the flaw, the design flaw in the oxygen tank thermostat that couldn't handle the test voltages. The lessons learned from Apollo 13 led to major design and procedural improvements for all subsequent missions. Why Apollo 13 is called a successful failure. Though Apollo 13 never landed on the moon, its safe return demonstrated NASA's ability to adapt under crisis conditions. The mission became an enduring example of training and preparation, teamwork under pressure, engineering problem solving, clear communication and leadership. Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert returned home as heroes. Lovell retired from NASA after Apollo 13. Haise later worked on the Space Shuttle program. Swigert entered politics and was elected to Congress, but tragically died of cancer before taking office. The legacy. Apollo 13 remains one of the best-known missions in space history, largely because of the extraordinary teamwork involved. The 1995 film, Apollo 13, brought renewed attention to the mission, dramatizing its events while keeping the core facts remarkably accurate. The spacecraft Odyssey now resides in Kansas at the Cosmosphere Museum, where visitors can see it today. Conclusion. Apollo 13's crisis gave the world a remarkable example of what humans can achieve when faced with impossible odds. Even 200,000 miles from home, a combination of ingenuity, training, and determination brought 3 astronauts safely back to Earth. Their story remains one of the greatest triumphs of space exploration, not for reaching the moon, but for surviving and overcoming disaster in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. This was 15 minutes of curiosity. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share. And remember, curiosity is what keeps us reaching for the stars.